Listen carefully, because once this story enters your mind, you cannot unhear it. In Alabama in the year 1850, an entire family lived under a shadow so heavy that neighbors whispered they were cursed. The Ellison family appeared wealthy, respected, and untouchable, but behind the carved oak doors of their plantation home was a pattern so chilling, so mathematically precise, it defied coincidence. Every daughter born into the Ellison bloodline disappeared on the night of her 16th birthday. Not a day later. Not a day earlier. Vanished. Gone. No body, no trace, no answers. Imagine being a child in that house, counting down the days of your life like grains of sand falling through a glass, knowing the hour of your own disappearance had already been set long before you were born. And yet the Ellisons did not flee, they did not hide their daughters away, and they never once begged the authorities to intervene. Instead, they carried themselves with an unsettling calm, as if the family's daughters weren't daughters at all, but offerings. You see, the most terrifying part is not the vanishing. It's the silence that followed. No screams, no search parties, no open grief. Only shutters closing, candles blown out, and the next morning, business as usual. Neighbors learned to stop asking questions. Because those who did, merchants, midwives, even one sheriff, soon met strange accidents. A crushed ribcage beneath a falling beam. A sudden drowning in a shallow creek. A rope that snapped at the wrong time. Was this superstition? A coincidence? Or was there an invisible hand pulling every thread? Tonight, you and I will dig through the buried records, the erased accounts, and the forbidden whispers that survived only in hidden journals. And what we'll uncover isn't just a family curse. It is a system, one tied to wealth, land, blood, and control. A system so ancient that the Ellisons were merely its servants, not its masters. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more dangerous this truth becomes. And if you're still here at the end, you'll realize the Ellison curse wasn't about daughters at all. It was about power. Imagine standing outside that plantation house on the night of a daughter's 16th birthday. The windows are dark, yet inside you sense movement, shadows on the walls, whispers carried like smoke through the cracks of the wood. The Ellison home was built differently than others in Alabama. Its foundations weren't laid on simple soil. They were poured directly over the ruins of an older dwelling, a settlement that predated official records. Local Creek tribes spoke of that land as the place where the earth does not forget. It was said to be haunted ground, where rituals once bound blood to stone. When James Ellison, the patriarch, purchased that land, he was warned, 3 times in fact, by elders who told him his family would pay a price for disturbing it. But wealth blinds men. The soil was rich, the river close, and his ambition stronger than superstition. He laughed in the faces of those warnings and built anyway. What the Ellisons never admitted, but what journals later revealed, was that on the eve of construction, James Ellison conducted a ceremony of his own. He brought a Bible, yes, but he also brought something else. A ledger from his ancestors in Virginia filled with strange symbols, half in English, half in something much older. That night, neighbors recalled seeing fires on his land that burned without wood, without smoke, glowing a deep, unnatural blue. From that day forward, the Ellison family prospered unnaturally fast. Cotton yields doubled. Rivers rose higher but never drowned their fields. Their wealth seemed protected. Yet every daughter, without fail, became the sacrifice. A balance sheet of blood for fortune. And the strangest thing? The family never resisted it. They carried it as though bound by contract. Because perhaps they were. The disappearance of every daughter wasn't the curse. It was the cost. And in Alabama of 1850, people began to wonder, had the Ellisons made a pact? When the first daughter vanished, the town whispered of abduction. A runaway perhaps. But when the second vanished under identical circumstances, voices lowered into fearful hush. By the third, the word curse was whispered. By the fourth, people no longer whispered, they avoided the family altogether. But what makes this story unbearable is what surfaced in one of the Ellison ledgers decades later. The daughters knew. Each girl, as she approached her 16th birthday, kept journals describing the dreams that haunted them. Nightmares where their voices were silenced, where faceless figures beckoned from the edges of candlelight. Pages where they wrote, "I will not see my 17th year." And yet, they never tried to escape. Not one of them fled into the woods or begged neighbors to hide them. Their words suggest something far darker: compliance. As if their fate had been planted into their minds from the day they could write. Was this fear passed down from mother to daughter, whispered lullabies of doom until the girls surrendered to expectation? Or was something else binding them, a force that eroded free will and replaced it with submission? The Ellisons were devout in public, but behind closed doors they practiced something more sinister. Evidence points to gatherings in the cellar, where symbols were carved into brick, where neighbors swore they heard voices speaking in tongues that no Englishman could recognize. And every 16th birthday the family locked themselves away, and by dawn, the daughter was gone. No body, no grave, no explanation, only an empty chair at the table. But ask yourself, what vanishes without a trace in a time when human life was cheap, when runaways and deaths were daily occurrences? The answer is uncomfortable. Only that which was not taken by men at all, but by something older. Something that demanded a covenant of silence and blood. The Ellisons had power, and power breeds immunity. Officials in Montgomery heard rumors, but they turned away. How do we know this? Because buried in the archives of county records is a letter, never meant to be seen, that tells the story from the inside. Sheriff Jonathan Hale in 1839 wrote a desperate plea to the governor: "There is something unnatural on Ellison land. It defies law, and yet I am told to leave it. My men are afraid, my family is afraid, and still the Ellisons thrive while their daughters are erased by night. If I press further, I fear I too shall be erased." Weeks later, Sheriff Hale drowned in less than 2 feet of water in a creek he had crossed all his life. His death was ruled accidental. His replacement never spoke of the Ellisons again. This was no longer a family matter, it had become institutional. Local power bent around the Ellisons like iron under heat. Judges refused cases, ministers blessed their wealth, and when parishioners whispered, they were reminded, God's ways are mysterious. But let's cut deeper, because wealth, influence, and silence are tools of control, not results of it. And as you'll see, the Ellisons weren't the only family paying this cost. Across America, in small towns and plantations, patterns emerged. Families prospering unnaturally, their success marked by unexplained tragedy. Was it coincidence, or was there a hidden network of blood oaths, contracts, and rituals disguised beneath the mask of Southern civility? The Ellisons, it seems, were simply one node in a much older design. Now let me tell you something chilling. Researchers who traced the Ellison lineage discovered that this pattern didn't begin in Alabama. It stretched back to Virginia to the 1700s, where records speak of girls taken by the river. The Ellisons were not victims. They were heirs to a contract sealed generations earlier. And here's where it turns darker. The terms of that contract demanded not just blood, but memory. Each disappearance was followed by erasure. Journals vanished, portraits removed, names scratched out of family Bibles. It was as if the daughters never existed. The only proof of their lives came from letters smuggled to friends, hidden in barns or buried in fields. And yet, those letters always carried the same plea: do not speak of me. Forget me. Think of that. A daughter begging not to be remembered, as though memory itself could awaken the curse. And what if that's true? What if speaking their names gave power to the force that claimed them? If so, then the silence of the town wasn't just fear, it was survival. And here's the hook. In suppressed documents, one minister confessed that the Ellisons were merely keepers of the gate. What gate? To what? He died before answering. His church later burned to the ground in a fire that began with no spark, no lightning, no reason. The ashes scattered, the truth buried deeper. But some whispers survived, and they suggest the Ellison disappearances weren't isolated events at all, but part of an ongoing harvest. The deeper you descend, the more the story shifts from folklore into something engineered. There is evidence, fragmented but undeniable, that the disappearances coincided with financial gains. A daughter vanished and the next season crops doubled. A daughter vanished and suddenly debts were erased, rivals ruined, shipments arriving unspoiled while storms tore others apart. This isn't random, it's transactional. Imagine a contract signed not with ink but with bloodlines, enforced not by law but by forces outside comprehension. And here's where your skin should crawl. Documents suggest the Ellisons weren't alone at the table. Other families, wealthy merchants, landowners, even men of the cloth, were tied to the same cycle. A hidden aristocracy feeding power through sacrifice. And Alabama wasn't the beginning, it was merely the continuation. What vanishes at 16? Youth, innocence, the threshold between child and woman. Why that age? Because it marks transition, transformation. To the Ellisons, it wasn't just a birthday, it was the hour of payment. And here's where you must listen carefully. Such contracts don't die with families. They migrate. They adapt. So when we study the Ellisons, we're not looking at history. We're looking at a mirror. One that reflects the mechanism still alive today. There's a chilling testimony recorded by a traveling preacher in 1844. He claimed he was invited to dine with the Ellisons, a rare privilege for an outsider. He described the house as filled with opulence but empty in spirit. Grand portraits of the men lined the walls, yet there were none of the daughters. When he asked why, the family grew silent. Then the patriarch leaned across the table and whispered, "Some things must not be remembered." That night, the preacher wrote in his journal that he woke to the sound of a girl's crying, muffled, somewhere beneath the floorboards. When he confronted James Ellison the next morning, he was told he had simply dreamed too much. The preacher left in haste, abandoning his route, and was never seen in Alabama again. His journal, however, survived, passed down through his descendants until it reached a library archive in Kentucky. Within its brittle pages, one line stood out in red ink: "The Ellisons do not lose daughters. They surrender them." Consider the weight of that phrasing. Surrender. Not taken, not stolen, but offered. That means the family was complicit. It wasn't just a curse imposed upon them, it was an agreement upheld willingly. Which raises the darker question. What did they believe they were receiving in return? Wealth and protection are obvious answers. But what if it was something else entirely? Knowledge, influence, the kind of unseen leverage that manipulates not just crops and fortune but people themselves. Let's pause for a moment and sink into this reality. Imagine being one of those daughters, raised in silks, schooled in etiquette, given all the luxuries a plantation fortune could afford. And yet, behind the fine gowns and smiling portraits, you carried a secret countdown that no one dared to interrupt. Every year, the family celebrated your birthday with grandeur. Yet beneath the music and laughter lurked an invisible clock, each tick louder than the last. 16 was not a coming of age. It was a death sentence. But here's the psychological trap. These daughters were conditioned from birth to accept their fate. They weren't rebels or runaways. They were groomed to become offerings, told in whispers that this was their role, their duty to the family. Imagine that conditioning, drilled so deeply that even fear gave way to surrender. This is how control works, not by chains and whips but by belief. Once you make someone believe their cage is sacred, they stop trying to escape it. And if that feels distant, think again. Because this same psychological machinery exists today in different forms. Systems built to make you believe you must sacrifice your dreams, your freedom, your very identity, for a promise of security that never truly comes. The Ellison daughters were not just victims of a curse. They were case studies in obedience and how power teaches silence. And silence, my friend, is the oldest prison of all. But here's where the story twists further. Not every daughter vanished quietly. In one hidden diary, Later uncovered in the ruins of the plantation house, there is an account from Margaret Ellison, who reached her 16th year in 1847. Her words tremble on the page. "I hear the voice calling, but I do not wish to go. I see shadows in the walls, faces in the mirror. They tell me I must walk into the cellar when the bell tolls midnight. Father says it is my honor, but I know it is my end." Margaret fought. She locked her door, she broke her mirror, she even tried to flee through the fields. But neighbors claimed they saw her wandering days later, smiling, calm, as though she had been emptied out and filled with something else. By the night of her birthday, she entered the cellar willingly. In the morning, she was gone like the others. This account introduces something even more disturbing. Resistance was possible, but not successful. Those who tried to fight were broken, psychologically dismantled, until their surrender became voluntary. This is not merely a curse. It is a system of control so complete that it rewrote the will of its victims. And if you think this ends with the Ellisons, you're mistaken. Because this technique of breaking resistance, of eroding the individual until they surrender willingly, has been mirrored in governments, religions, and corporations for centuries. What happened in that house was not just ritual, it was rehearsal for the kind of control that still rules you today. So who, or what, were the Ellisons surrendering their daughters to? This is where history darkens beyond comfort. Accounts mention the figure in the cellar, always described differently. To one it was a man in black, faceless, tall as the ceiling. To another, it was a mass of shifting shadows, never standing still. Some believed it was the devil himself. Others whispered it was an older god, one not written in scripture but etched into the soil long before settlers came. The Creek tribes had their own warnings about that land, calling it the ground where voices slip between worlds. Could it be that the Ellisons tapped into an older covenant, one that demanded blood in exchange for favor? And if so, why daughters? 16, again and again, ritualistic precision. To the Ellisons, their prosperity was proof of the bargain's power. But prosperity at what cost? Here is where the psychological knife twists. When you see results, you no longer question the sacrifice. The family convinced themselves it was justified, even holy. And this, too, is a reflection of how the world still operates. Institutions tell you the cost of progress is suffering, the cost of wealth is exploitation, the cost of peace is war. And just like the Ellisons, we nod, accept, and continue. We are told the sacrifice is necessary, inevitable. But is it? Or is it only necessary for those who profit from it? And here lies the most forbidden revelation of all. In 1850, the last recorded disappearance of an Ellison daughter took place. Her name was Catherine. Unlike the others, her journal ends abruptly with only 3 words: "They are here." No explanation, no description, just those words. The night she vanished, lightning struck the plantation house, igniting a fire that consumed it entirely. Witnesses say the flames burned white, not red, and that the screams inside were not human. When the ashes cooled, no bodies were found. Not Catherine. Not her parents. Not the servants. Nothing. Only scorched earth, blackened stones, and symbols carved into the surviving foundations, symbols that matched those in James Ellison's ancestral ledger. The Ellison line ended that night, erased in fire and silence. Officially, the tragedy was filed as accidental lightning. But ask yourself, how does lightning carve symbols into stone? How does lightning erase an entire family without leaving a single trace of bone or ash? It doesn't. Something else claimed them. And here's the part they'll never tell you. The Ellisons may be gone, but the covenant is not. It simply moved. Migrated. Hidden in other families, other names, other systems of power. The harvest continues. The daughters are still vanishing, you just don't hear about it anymore. Because the silence is deeper now, institutionalized, global. Which means the story of the Ellisons isn't just about Alabama 1850. It's about you right now listening to these words. After the fire of 1850, The Ellison name vanished from property ledgers as if erased by decree. Yet within weeks, the land was quietly purchased by a company no one in Alabama had heard of, the Southern Development Trust. Its board members were anonymous. Its seal bore the same five-pointed emblem that had been carved into the Ellison stones. Workers who cleared the ruins reported finding glass jars sealed with wax, each containing strands of human hair and faded scraps of parchment written in a language no one could read. Every man who touched those jars fell ill within days. The site was declared unfit for agriculture and fenced off, but the trust continued paying taxes on it for decades. That alone defies logic. Why keep worthless land? Unless the value lay beneath the soil. Researchers later discovered that the trust's directors had ties to rail magnates, bankers, and a few Washington officials. The Ellison tragedy wasn't buried, it was absorbed. Their curse became an asset. The more you follow the money, the more the pattern emerges. Catastrophe converted into control. And that, right there, is the oldest secret of power. Nothing is destroyed, it's only rebranded. Years later, in 1872, a surveyor named Elijah Moore mapped the property for a proposed railway. His notes, found in a trunk at an estate auction, describe a humming in the earth and metal beneath the clay. He claimed to have struck an iron lid the size of a wagon wheel, fused into rock, vibrating like a heartbeat. That night, Moore went blind. His assistant fled and swore he heard voices coming from the ground repeating one phrase, "The gate remains." The project was abandoned, yet the trust's payments continued. Think about that, an invisible corporation protecting an invisible gate. This is not myth, it's economics woven with ritual. When wealth, secrecy, and faith converge, you don't get religion or business. You get control systems disguised as both. The Ellison Blood Pact became a prototype. Every hidden institution since has followed the same blueprint. Trade something sacred for power, bury the cost, reward obedience. The plantation was their testing ground. The modern world is the result. By 1901, a new mansion rose near the same coordinates, this time under another name, the Graysons. No public record links them to the Ellisons, yet portraits in the attic reveal familiar faces. Identical eyes, identical scars behind the left ear. The Graysons hosted lavish gatherings for industrialists and clergy, where attendees discussed progress through inheritance. Guests described a subterranean chamber lined with black marble, where music played in reverse and mirrors covered every wall. The centerpiece? A glass case holding a single lock of blonde hair labeled C. 1849. Catherine Ellison. The Graysons claimed it was a family relic, but diaries from their servants speak of nightmares and of hearing a young woman's voice echoing through the vents, whispering names of future daughters. The Graysons' first child, a girl, died on her 16th birthday. The newspapers called it pneumonia. But witnesses saw the same white fire rise from the cellar that night. History had repeated, only under a new surname. The covenant hadn't died, it had evolved like a contagion changing hosts. This is where the line between myth and manipulation blurs completely. Around 1910, a leaked correspondence between a banker named Horace Fenn and a senator from Virginia referenced continuing the Ellison arrangement under federal supervision. Their goal? To harness ritualized sacrifice not for crops or weather, but for influence, what they called mass persuasion. Fenn wrote, "If belief can compel a child to surrender her life, imagine what engineered belief can make a nation surrender." That single sentence should freeze your blood. The Ellison tragedy was not an isolated haunting. It was a demonstration of programmable faith. Replace gods with ideologies, altars with media, priests with politicians, and you control millions without a single flame. The senator's reply is chillingly calm. The principle is sound. Proceed. Shortly afterward, Fenn disappeared during a steamboat trip, and the letters were buried in archives until a whistleblower uncovered them a century later. The pattern never broke, it scaled. Now we reach the pivot point, the moment your perspective changes forever. The Ellison curse wasn't supernatural punishment. It was proof of concept. How to make people participate in their own erasure while calling it destiny. When you look closely, you'll see this template replicated everywhere, from the doctrines that demand obedience to the corporations that trade your attention like currency. The same psychology refined for a new age. The daughters of the Ellison line were taught to believe their disappearance served a higher order. Today, billions are taught the same lie in quieter form. That submission is virtue, that questioning is sin, that comfort equals freedom. But the truth is inverted. The more obedient a population becomes, the stronger the unseen gate remains. And if you've followed me this far, you already feel the cracks forming in that illusion. You are no longer a spectator to a 19th century mystery, you are standing at its edge. If you understand what's really being said here, comment the phrase, "The gate remains," twice below. Do it not for superstition but as a declaration that you see the pattern. And while you're here, subscribe, because what comes next pulls this darkness straight into the present day. When the Grayson house finally collapsed in 1933, it wasn't fire that brought it down. It was rot, from within, like a body decaying after death. Yet even then, investigators found a sealed chamber under the ruins. Inside lay stacks of ledgers with a familiar symbol burned into the covers. These weren't records of crops or finances. They were records of people. Names, ages, birth dates, all girls, marked with a date beside each name. The last page bore a single phrase in neat script. "The program is complete." That word, program, should make you tremble. No longer a curse, no longer even a covenant. A program. Something engineered, replicable, transferable. The Ellison story was no longer about one family or one house. It had become a template for how to harvest not bodies but minds. The ledgers vanished into government storage soon after their discovery. No public photographs. No official acknowledgement. But fragments slipped out through archivists and descendants, like sparks from a dying fire. Enough to reconstruct the shape of the thing. And that shape looks eerily like the world you live in now. In 1952, a behavioral scientist named Dr. A.W. Kerr referenced the Ellison Protocol in a classified paper on mass influence. He called it voluntary compliance under ritual conditioning. According to a leaked draft, the protocol's foundation was simple. Teach the subject that the sacrifice is inevitable, then convince them it is sacred. Once those two beliefs fuse, the subject's own will finishes the work. No chains required. Kerr's notes mention the original Alabama demonstration and the 16-year threshold as proof of concept. This is not folklore anymore. This is documented strategy. And while Kerr's research disappeared from public view, the era that followed, advertising's golden age, psychological warfare, mass media manipulation, mirrored its principles perfectly. The Ellisons had offered daughters. The modern world offers something else. Your time, your identity, your freedom of thought. And you hand it over not because someone takes it, but because you've been taught to believe it's part of the deal. Think about the number 16 again. In old European traditions, 16 marked the age of confirmation, debut, coming out. A ritual threshold between childhood and the obligations of adulthood. The Ellisons didn't invent this age, they weaponized it. And today, corporations and governments still target transitions. They shape the minds of the young just before they enter full autonomy, saturating them with images, expectations, and fears until their choices aren't their own. The age has shifted, sometimes 13, sometimes 18, but the principle is unchanged. Control the threshold and you control the life beyond it. This is why recruitment, indoctrination, and mass marketing focus on youth. It is Ellison logic on a global scale. They don't need a seller. They need a screen. They don't need a ritual. They need an algorithm. And you sit before it every day convinced you're free, while invisible hands draw you to the gate. And here's the part that cuts deepest. You've been told that history's dark rituals are relics, that they belonged to dusty plantations and secret societies. But the truth is they were prototypes. Every major power structure you live under now, financial, political, even digital, descends from the same blueprint. The Ellison family's curse was only one chapter in a much larger book, a book written to teach the elite how to extract obedience, memory, and vitality from entire populations without visible chains. When you scroll, when you sign, when you comply without question, you're walking into the modern cellar, brightly lit, frictionless, voluntary. The only difference is that now the sacrifice isn't your body at 16. It's your attention, your will, your future. And the harvest is constant. The gate has been scaled up, made invisible, global. The pattern survived because no one recognized it for what it was. Until now. Look at the way institutions frame your choices. Look at how media frames your fears. Every message tells you the same thing the Ellison daughters were told. You must give up something precious to belong, you must obey to be safe, you must forget to move forward. This is the Ellison protocol, stripped of its candles and symbols, dressed in policies and pixels. And the only way out of it is recognition. Seeing the pattern breaks its power. That's why they keep you distracted, overwhelmed, divided, so you never trace the line back to its source. But you've been tracing it with me. You've seen how a single family's curse was a controlled experiment in ritualized compliance, later rebranded as behavioral science, now rebranded again as convenience. This is not just Alabama 1850. This is everywhere. This is now. And once you see it, you can never go back to who you were before. When you first hear the Ellison story, it feels like a gothic nightmare, blood, fire, daughters disappearing into shadows. But now, after following it through ledgers, symbols, and institutions, you can see what it really is. A map of how control evolves. The gate on Ellison land was not a door in the soil. It was a door in the mind. 16 wasn't just an age. It was a point of programming. A ritual designed to make the victim believe the sacrifice is inevitable, holy, even necessary. The flames, the whispers, the curse, all theater to reinforce the narrative. The moment you understand that, you can start to see the same rituals playing out in your own life. Deadlines disguised as destinies, rules disguised as morality, contracts disguised as culture. The only difference is scale. Their cellar is your screen. Their midnight bell is your notification. The question is whether you'll keep walking into it, or whether you'll pause here and ask who benefits from your obedience. There's a hidden line in a journal attributed to Catherine Ellison, dated 3 days before she vanished. They taught me my fear was devotion, my surrender was freedom. That's the knife edge of the protocol. If you can be convinced that giving yourself up is an act of loyalty, you will do it willingly. The plantation, the school, the office, the feed, they all reward the same reflex. Self-erasure in exchange for belonging. But Catherine's line is also a key. She wrote it down. She saw the pattern. Recognition cracks the ritual. That's why her journal ends abruptly. She had begun to wake up. That's why you're here now, listening to a voice that was never supposed to reach you. You're standing in the same place Catherine stood, between the cellar door and the open field. You've been told the field is empty, but it's not. It's freedom. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. The Ellison daughters lived it. They stopped trying to escape because escape had been made to feel impossible. Every failed attempt reinforced the belief that surrender was inevitable. That's the whole trick. Break the spirit and the body walks itself to the altar. But the inverse is just as true. One act of defiance, one moment of recognition, can collapse the whole edifice. This is why repressive systems invest so heavily in distraction and noise. If you're too busy, too entertained, too exhausted to look at the pattern, you'll never find the weak point. That weak point is always the same choice. The Ellison protocol only works if you believe you have none. The moment you see the door, the spell begins to break. Hidden inside a congressional transcript from 1971 is a chilling remark by an unnamed advisor. The Ellison demonstration proved the scalability of ritual. We've simply removed the altars. That sentence is buried under layers of bureaucratic jargon, but its meaning is plain. The rituals that shaped the Ellisons now shape you, digitally, financially, socially, without candles or cellars. They work because you volunteer. But here's the dangerous part they won't tell you. Once you see the mechanism, you can stop feeding it. This is why stories like this are buried, why archives are sealed, why researchers disappear. Not because of superstition, but because of leverage. A population that understands its own programming is ungovernable. You're not just hearing a dark family history. You're holding a match over centuries of conditioning. This is the moment in the descent when the story stops being about the Ellisons and starts being about you. You're not a passive listener anymore. You're a participant. Every ritual they used on those daughters, countdowns, symbols, language, secrecy, still runs today but on a mass scale. And you're not powerless. Recognition is resistance. If you felt a shift while listening to this, that's not an accident. It's the old machinery losing its grip. Write the phrase "the gate remains" twice in the comments. Do it as a symbolic act, not to feed an algorithm but to plant a flag in your own mind. It marks the point where you stopped walking toward the cellar and started looking for the door out. Subscribe while you're at it. Not because you're told to, but because you've decided to follow this trail all the way down. What comes next will take you into the present, where the gate has been rebuilt around you, invisible and enormous, and show you how to walk through it. You've now crossed the threshold Catherine Ellison never got to cross. This isn't history anymore. It's the same mechanism dressed in digital skin. The gate has been rebuilt without walls, without guards, without rituals you can see. It's a lattice of incentives, alerts, and manufactured urgencies designed to keep you in a loop. Your eyes move across glowing rectangles, your thumb scrolls, your heart accelerates. All of it is a version of that same cellar countdown. Stay, obey, don't question, don't leave. The Ellison estate burned in 1850, but the protocol survived because it didn't depend on bricks. It depended on belief. And belief can be shipped across centuries. Every time you check instead of choose, you're handing the key back. Every time you pause and question, you're prying it open. This is where the Ellison story stops being a warning and starts being a blueprint for your own escape. Look at the way the Ellison daughters were handled in the days before they disappeared. Gifts, promises, special treatment, a sense that something great awaited them if they simply obeyed. Then, darkness. That's exactly how mass systems work now. They give you a hit of validation, a badge, a streak, a perk. They tell you you're about to level up if you stay in the system just a little longer. That moment of promise is not kindness. It's the prelude to the vanishing. Your attention vanishes, your time vanishes, your selfhood thins out like smoke. The only reason it works is because you were taught to crave the ritual. Break the craving and the ritual collapses. Ask yourself, what would you be if you stopped walking toward the cellar door? Not what would you lose, what would you become? That's the question that terrifies them. Catherine Ellison tried to smuggle out instructions. One of her fragments reads, "A mirror can be a door." Historians dismissed it as madness. But look at what you're holding now, your screen reflecting your face back at you. That mirror is their door. It's where the gate is coded. It's how you're observed, measured, and nudged. But the mirror can also be turned. The very tool they use to trap you can be used to free you, if you use it consciously instead of reflexively. That's the twist Catherine never got to live out. The ritual is reversible. If you begin to see the patterns, to log them, to refuse the bait, the gate stops working. It's not mystical. It's mechanical. And mechanical things can be broken. When the Ellison estate burned, a group of men stood outside the flames, smiling. They weren't mourning, they were satisfied. The experiment had proven its point. The girls were gone, the line erased, but the method was intact. Those same men, or their ideological heirs, moved on to social engineering, to behavioral economics, to predictive analytics. Every breakthrough in control is sold to you as convenience. That's the genius of it. A curse becomes an app. An altar becomes a dashboard. The very word ritual disappears, replaced by user experience. And yet, underneath, the logic is unchanged. Capture attention, extract devotion, prevent escape. This isn't paranoia. This is history wearing a new mask. And once you see the mask, you can stop mistaking it for a face. This is the deepest point of the rabbit hole. If you've stayed with me this far, you've already felt it, the shift from curiosity to recognition. You're not just hearing about a haunted plantation, you're feeling the ghost of its machinery in your own life. That's by design. The Ellison story isn't an anecdote, it's an X-ray. And here's the decision point. You can close the window and let the program resume, or you can write down what you've seen, share it, talk about it, begin to act differently. That's why I built this channel, to show you the patterns so you can step out of them. If you haven't yet, subscribe. Not because of the ritual, but because you're choosing to keep learning how to break it. This is the point Catherine never reached. But you can. The next section will show you how the gate was built over your lifetime, how it's maintained, and where its weak seams still run. The Ellison ritual survived because nobody named it out loud. It moved in whispers, coded in etiquette, in how things are done. That's exactly how the modern gate survives. It hides in your habits. No guards. No chains. Only patterns. Patterns you learn to call normal. Work that bleeds into your nights. News that provokes outrage but never action. Feeds that give you 1,000 fragments but no whole. These aren't accidents. They're seams sewn into your day. Once you spot the stitch, you can start cutting. Start with one act. Silence the bells. Break a notification. Stop the countdown. That's how you know you've touched the seam, when the system resists, when the craving surfaces, when you feel the pull to check just once more. That's the echo of the cellar calling you back. Don't go. Catherine Ellison's last surviving scrap reads, "Draw the map while you're still inside." This is the next seam. You're not just a victim of the program, you're a cartographer of it. As you move through your day, log what triggers you, what drags you back to the ritual. Is it a time? A screen? A word? A face? Every trigger you name loses some of its hold. This is how suppressed truths were always preserved, through secret diaries, coded letters, whispered confessions. That's what we're doing here. That's why I tell you this like a mentor pulling you down the rabbit hole. I'm giving you the shape of the maze so you can walk out. But you must make the map yourself. That's how identity transforms. Not from hearing the story, but from writing your own. A study buried in a 1983 defense think tank memo, the kind you'd never see unless you were looking, calls it behavioral drift reinforcement. It's the updated name for what the Ellisons endured. The idea is simple. Repeat a pattern long enough and the mind accepts it as reality. That's why rituals start young. That's why Catherine's 16th birthday was the line. And that's why today's gate starts early. Feed children loops, streaks, wins, losses until the pattern feels like the world itself. But here's what they know and won't tell you. Drift can be reversed. Reinforcement can be rewritten. Patterns can be interrupted. One interruption at a time. That's not rebellion in the old sense. It's reclaiming the authorship of your own nervous system. At this depth, you may start to feel something strange. A pull between horror and clarity. That's the right signal. Horror because you see how deep it goes. Clarity because you see it at all. This is the seam they fear most. Awareness that doesn't dissolve into despair. Despair is still control. Awareness plus agency is escape. When you reach this state, old appetites lose their shine. Old scripts read like stage plays. You start to watch the actors instead of the show. That's when you know you're no longer inside the Ellison cellar. You're standing outside, looking in, deciding whether to strike a match. That's why this channel exists. That's why I ask you to stay. Because this moment right now is rare. For over a century, the Ellison protocol sat dormant, not because it failed but because it succeeded. Its principles were exported, refined, disguised. Today it has no single name, no single building, no single leader. It exists as a network of think tanks, marketing firms, intelligence outfits, predictive analytics teams and algorithmic architects who all feed the same hunger: capture, measure, shape. They will never call it the Ellison protocol. They'll call it engagement, retention, optimization, nudging. But the bones are the same. The old altar is now a dashboard. The priest is a data scientist. The hymn is your own scrolling. And the fire that took the daughters is now a stream of content burning through your hours. They don't have to hide anymore because no one believes a curse could look like convenience. But even networks have seams. No ritual is perfect. Power leaks at its edges. The first crack is transparency, naming what it is. Once you name the mechanism, you start seeing it everywhere. The second crack is collective refusal, people recognizing the pattern at the same time, stepping off the loop together. That's why the protocol works so hard to isolate you, to make you believe you're the only one who feels this, the only one who notices. You're not. That's also why stories like Catherine's get buried. They're maps of resistance. Every time someone pulls a hidden story into daylight, the gate loses a brick. And the third crack is choice, the small daily interruptions. Choosing what to feed, what to ignore, what to build instead. That's where the machine can't follow you. It can predict your habits, not your awakenings. Catherine Ellison never escaped. But her fragments survived. That's her victory. They were supposed to burn with the estate, but a single journal was smuggled out by a field hand who refused to be invisible. That act, one person choosing differently, outlived the whole plantation. That's how you fight a system too large to confront head-on. Not with one grand rebellion, but with thousands of small acts of disobedience, each one leaving a trace for the next person. This is why I've asked you to write phrases to mark your shift, to subscribe of your own free will. Not to build a cult, but to create a breadcrumb trail out of the maze. When you do it consciously, you turn the ritual inside out. You stop being the experiment and start being the anomaly.